today you guys are watching the video on factoring with the greatest common factor. Okay, now factoring is something that you would have covered back in Algebra 1. It's a concept where basically you are simplifying polynomial expressions, and in this case we're looking for the number or the term in which the number or the variable in which every single term has in common. Okay, so the reason why we're starting with GCF is because no matter what type of polynomial you're dealing with, you always start with the greatest common factor first. And then once you factor out that greatest common factor and write whatever's left over, then from there you can apply all the different types of ways that you can factor, which you'll learn about within the next couple of days. So we're going to start with factoring with the greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor is basically, again, what does every single term have in common? What's the greatest thing, number, variable, that each term has in common? So in this case, we'll look at this 6x to the fifth minus 12x squared. We'll look at the numbers first. We have 6 and 12. What is the greatest common factor that 6 and 12 have in common? Well, hopefully you'll say that it's a 6, okay? Because think about it. 6 divided by 6 is 1, and 12 divided by 6 is 2. Okay, so 6 is a factor of both 6 and 12. Then you look at your variables. The first term has x to the fifth. The second term has x squared. So if you're looking to figure out, okay, well, what do both of those terms have in common? Well, they both have an x squared in common. They basically have two x's in common for both terms. So 6x squared is our GCF, is our greatest common factor. So once we factor that out, we basically have to write what's remaining once we take out a 6x squared. Well, simple enough as it is. Alright, so since 6x squared is our GCF, we basically say, okay, 6 divided by 6. Okay, well that's a 1. I've taken out every possible factor of that first term, and if I take out an x squared from an x to the fifth, that leaves me with an x to the third. Okay, so basically when we divide here, we just subtract our exponents. Then we have our minus. 12 divided by 6 is 2, and then x squared divided by x squared is just 1. So this right here is the factored form of 6x to the fifth minus 12x squared. Our GCF is 6x squared, and that leaves us with an x cubed minus 2 left over. Now one way you can check is if you were to distribute back through, you should end up with what you started with. Let's look at the next one. 8x to the fourth plus 32a squared. Well, the greatest common factor between 8 and 32 is an 8. And the greatest common factor between an a to the fourth and an a squared is an a squared. Alright? Now if you're really having a hard time trying to see this broken down, especially with your variables, we'll then separate them. A to the fourth is basically a times a times a times a. A to the second is just a times a. So if you notice, both factors have two a's in common, hence the a squared. As for your numbers, well, you just got to know your factors. You got to know what numbers multiply to give you 8 and what numbers multiply to give you 32, and you're looking for the number that is the greatest out of all of those. Okay? Think about it. If I were to figure out what two numbers multiply to give me 8, well, that's 1 times 8. That's 2 times 4. What numbers multiply to give me 32? Well, that's 1 and 32. 2 and 16. 4 and 8. And so then you're looking for what's the greatest common factor between 8 and 32. Well, it's the number, the largest number that both of the numbers have in common. And that's where the 8 comes from. So that's how you get 8a squared as your greatest common factor. So when you take out an 8a squared from the first term, that just leaves you with an a squared, because 8 divided by 8 is 1. And 8 to the fourth divided by 8 squared is just 8 to the second. Then 32 divided by 8 is 4. And a squared divided by a squared is 1. At any point in time in this video, if you are confused, you can rewind, you can pause, you can try the problem yourself and then check the answer. Let's look at the next one, negative 6a squared plus 6a. Whenever there's a negative in front, your first term, you want to factor out a negative when you factor out your greatest common factor. It just makes things a lot easier, especially when we start factoring different types of problems. So we're going to factor out a negative first, and then what is the GCF between 6a squared and 6a? Hopefully you said 6a, because both terms have a 6 in common and both terms have at least 1a. So when I take out a negative 6a, that leaves me with just 1a left over. And then when I take out a negative 6a from the second term, that's going to turn into a minus 1. Just think about it. The only way to get a positive here is if I multiply a negative and a negative, which is what I would do if I were to distribute back through. So if I were to distribute back through, that would give you a negative 6a squared, and then here you get a positive 6a. So whenever you take out a negative, it changes the signs of your terms. All right? Pause this video and try this next one. Hopefully, you did pause the video and you actually tried to at least factor out what is the GCF. Within these first 3 terms, there is no number that each one of these have in common. 4, 5, and 6, there's no number that all 3 of those have in common. So you can't take out a number. But you should notice that each term has at least one x in common and one y in common. So xy is our GCF for this particular polynomial. So when I take out an xy from the first term, that leaves me with a 4. From the second term, that leaves me with a 5x, because I had 2 x's there, but I took out 1. And then from the last term, that leaves me with a 6y. And then this is our GCF. Try this one. Pause it. Try this one. Okay, did you find the GCF to be 2y squared z? Hopefully so, because the greatest common factor between 16, 30, and 8 is a positive 2. Yes, 16 and 8 both have an 8 in common, but 30 is not divisible by 8. So 2 is your greatest common factor. Not every term had an x in it, just the first 2. The last one didn't have any x's, so you couldn't take out an x because it wasn't in every term. However, each term did have at least 2 y's in common and then at least 1 z. So when you factor that out, that leaves you with an 8x y z to the third plus 15x squared minus 4z. And you have factored that polynomial. So hopefully this video will help you with your worksheet that you're about to work on. It is just factoring with your greatest common factor. If you need further assistance, you can always go to Khan Academy or YouTube and Google search factoring with the GCF.